Professor Rod O'Donnell is a conceptual economist with a focus on pluralist economics, the foundations of economic reasoning and the teaching of economics. So he has an outstanding research and teaching reputation and holds 5 teaching awards, including a 2013 Australian Government Excellence in University Teaching Award. So he is co-editor of the Australian Journal of Economics Education. He's a member of the 2012 to 2013 Economics Learning Standards Working Party. He currently holds an ARC grant to prepare a multi-volume edition of Keynes's remaining unpublished writings. So please join me in making Professor Rod O'Donnell.
Thank you, James. And thank you for the invitation to come down and talk to you. I really appreciate that. There's a student movement building in various campuses in Australia and around the world. In June I was at the Rethinking Economics Conference in London, and that was a very impressive event. They had invited Nobel laureates and so forth. They had people coming, students coming from all over Europe to attend this, and the basic message was we need curriculum reform in economics, badly. And so I want to continue with that theme today. I want to help open your minds to, or open them further, to the idea of pluralist economics and the importance of that and the history of economic thought. The topic I've chosen to tie these things together is uncertainty in economics, how it's theorized and dealt with. First, I will provide a review of how uncertainty is treated in orthodox or neoclassical economics. And that review will be pretty critical because they don't like uncertainty very much. It mucks up the theories and the models too much. Then I'll go on to pluralist approaches to uncertainty, but I'll single out the person I study mostly, and that's Keynes, who did the most to bring uncertainty fully back into economics. And then I'll wrap up with some concluding remarks as we go. So, let's begin. This is a big topic. I can't cover everything, so I'm going to focus on the key issues. And it's got very important connections to money, time, policy making, and other key areas of economics. We all know uncertainty about the future and about even the present and the past is an inescapable fact of life. It has a huge influence on economic behaviour. All decision making is conducted in a context of uncertainty, and systems operate in contexts of uncertainty. So it ought to be there in the beginning of our study of economics, because it's dreadfully important. But in some schools of thought, it's not there. So when I talk about schools of thought, I'm going to be talking about the core theory of that school of thought. That's the most important bit. That's what gets taught to you when you do mainstream economics, the core theory. Of course, there's research going on around the peripheries, which can be different from the core theory. It might be in conflict with the core theory, or it might be trying to extend the core theory, but it's not consistent. But whatever's going on in the periphery never comes back to the centre and influences the main conclusions of the core theory. So that's why I'm emphasising the core theory. If I say the whole of neoclassical economics ignores this, people will put up their hands and say, no they don't, there's some people working on this. Yes, all right, I know, but they're at the periphery. So focus on the core. What do we mean by uncertainty? I think it's pretty straightforward as a concept. It derives from ignorance. We don't know some things, whether it's about the future, the present, or the past. We don't know all the things we want to know. We might know some things, or we might know nothing. Whatever the situation is, if you're ignorant or you lack knowledge, you are in a situation of uncertainty. So uncertainty has degrees. Sometimes you know a fair amount and you might be able to form probabilities. Okay, you still have uncertainty, you don't know what's going to happen, but you've got some guide to what is most likely to happen. Other times, you know nothing. So uncertainty will come in 2 forms. A weak form, which is kind of tameable, controllable, and you can stick it into your models. That's where you know enough to be able to form probabilities. or you're given a structure in an economy or a structure of reasoning which gives you enough information to apply mathematical models. That's weak uncertainty. But the more important kind is strong uncertainty, where you know practically nothing, you can't form probabilities, the future is just a blank. You can guess what it is, but your estimates are no more than guesses. So we'll deal with both. It's a strong form that's really important in reality. That's what people have to cope with in the real world, not the toy world of some economic theories. So let's have a look at neoclassical economics, or sometimes I call it just orthodox economics. What's the core? It's an individual, but an individual of a specific kind. The individual is the starting point of all analysis. It's the basic building block of the theory. What kind of individual are we dealing with? We're dealing with an independent individual that doesn't have connections with other people, they're isolated atoms, and they are self-focused or self-interested. It's their own utility or profit that matters. And that's what they're trying to do. Optimize or maximize the objective function, usually that's utility or profit. And that is then equated to rationality. If you're not doing that, you're irrational. That's, in the smallest number of words I can make it, the core of neoclassical theory. The rest is all an extension of that. But if individuals are going to optimize, then you have to provide them with the means of doing the optimization. And that's basically two things. They need enough knowledge, accurate, perfect, correct knowledge of the situation before them, as defined by the theorist, so that they can accurately optimize. Now, you must be able to accurately optimize. No one in the theory optimizes and gets it wrong. Optimization means reaching the maximum. It's not an approximation, they actually get there. So the information has to be 100% accurate for them to get to the maximum that they're chasing. The other thing they need to have is the ability to do whatever calculations or whatever reasoning is needed to do the optimization. People have estimated that if a real person, if they were, well, even an imaginary person, optimizing, just walking into a standard supermarket with, let's say, 10,000 items on the shelves, how many possible baskets of commodities have you got in front of you? It's beyond millions, it's beyond trillions, it's a huge number that you then have to compute, well, which one of those baskets, all those possible combinations is going to give me the maximum utility. It's a huge, stupendous calculation task, which is beyond even a very powerful computer. But you need those things, they are necessary conditions for optimization. So orthodox economics, focused on this optimizing individual, is obliged to provide or to assume the individuals have the correct knowledge and abilities to do that optimization. If it doesn't do that, doesn't give the agent, endow the agents with that knowledge and ability, agents can't optimize and the theory falls apart. So you need perfect knowledge. Assuming perfect knowledge is essential for neoclassical economics. But remember, it can come in various forms depending on how the theory is set up. In standard, core, micro, macro, first year, second year, the assumption is that agents know what is actually going to happen in the future. So all of those examples of, trade-offs and opportunity costs and so forth, about celebrity basketball players deciding not to go to college but to go to basketball and earn pots of money, etc., etc. It's never put in a framework of perfect knowledge, but for that basketball player to optimize, they have to know their future. If they're brilliant and sign up with a basketball club and then get an injury that forces them out of the game, that's the end of the fortune. They would have been better off going to college and becoming an economist or a doctor or whatever and having an ordinary life in the suburbs, earning a reasonable salary. That would optimize their lifetime income much better than becoming a star for a short period, then end of career injury, it's all over. you've got to go back to college or do something else. So that's the first one. Number two is you give the agent knowledge of all possible futures. You let a little bit of uncertainty into the system. You say, well, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, so we'll deal with uncertainty in that way. But they substitute for that the idea that agents know all possible futures. And in general equilibrium theory, if you've ever, well, you'll do it at some stage, the setup is there is a market, a complete set of contingent markets, they're called, where if it's raining in the year 2045 and something else has happened and a whole lot of other ifs and ifs and ifs, then there's a market for supplying and demanding wheat of a certain kind under those conditions. So given all the possible futures that can happen, you can make your trades, your buying and selling plans and optimize using all those possibilities. Again, these markets are non-existent. They're just imaginary constructs. And the calculation exercise is enormous. But behind it lies the assumption of perfect knowledge, not about the actual future, but about all possible futures. And the third method is to invent, create, introduce some method for calculating the future. Does anyone guess what that is? Rational expectations theory allows you, they make the assumption that every agent has a true model of the economy in their heads. So if there's a change, some exogenous change in a variable, you simply plug that into your model, turn the handle, and out comes the answer. The price level will rise so much and wages will go do this, and any other variable you're interested in, it will crank out the answer. So you need, the perfect knowledge there is perfect knowledge of the true model of the economy, and there's only one true model that everyone has, plus some knowledge about the behaviour of the error term. Rational expectations never explains the story that way. They have a different way, which camouflages the perfect knowledge assumption. But anyway, the point is there are different forms in which this perfect knowledge assumption can be deployed. Often hidden, unstated, and so forth, but they're necessary conditions, so they have to be there somewhere. All right, so I've just done that a little bit. What I've called PK1, that's base level perfect knowledge. You know the actual future. Even benefit cost analysis, the standard individual doing their benefit cost analysis, figuring out which is the best option, best alternative for them to choose. And then that leads into supply and demand analysis. Supply and demand cross depends on perfect knowledge. There's an even bigger restriction on it that you can only get a supply curve under conditions of perfect competition, which doesn't exist and can't exist. So strictly speaking, supply and demand analysis is inapplicable, even in an imaginary world, because it can't exist. That's another argument. But it infects all of the standard tools and ideas that you get exposed to first, second, and third year economics. Second one, general equilibrium, I call that PK2. You have this complete set of contingent markets, you have perfect knowledge about all the possible outcomes, and then the last one, rational expectations. The way it camouflages its assumption, it says, look, we're just proposing a very reasonable idea. I'm sorry, I have to watch the camera. The very reasonable idea that rational agents use all the information available. So who's going to argue against that? No one. It's a perfectly sensible, reasonable proposition. But what they really mean is, in that information available to every rational agent is knowledge of the true model of the economy. And guess where that comes from? It comes from the rational expectations people who provide that model. So you often have to dig beneath the words to look for the real assumptions that are driving the analysis. So the consequences for orthodox economics, yes, it can deal with some forms of uncertainty, the weak forms. But, that's to say when you have probabilities, let's say. But you can only put those weak forms into the core theory by enclosing them in some other broader perfect knowledge assumption. Like, okay, we don't know the actual future, PK1, but we know all possible futures, PK2. So it looks like you're dealing with uncertainty in the sense that you don't know the actual future, but you're just substituting a different kind of perfect knowledge that allows you to say that without escaping from the perfect knowledge that allows agents to optimize. Okay, so that's all that. So, and often you'll find in the textbooks as you move through the syllabus, maybe postgrad or third year, some textbooks will start saying, okay, up till now, all the theory's been based on perfect knowledge, something they didn't say at the beginning when you did it in first and second year, but they're prepared to say in graduate school. We're now going to relax that assumption and assume that people don't know what the future is. And then they go through that business of substituting a different form of perfect knowledge. But what they're doing is always providing a framework in which the agent can optimize. And by claiming to deal with uncertainty, to now relax the perfect knowledge assumption and then deal with uncertainty, it's a pseudo-claim because they're dealing with pseudo-uncertainty. They're not dealing with uncertainty in general. They can't. You must have that perfect knowledge there for the optimizing agent construction to proceed. So it can't deal with strong uncertainty, and that's the important kind. And that's a major limitation. Every real person, every real household, business person, whatever, making a decision about what to spend their money on in buying consumption items, where they're going to put their savings, what kind of asset are they going to buy, or a business person deciding where they're going to invest, deals with situations of strong uncertainty, sometimes called radical uncertainty, fundamental uncertainty, irreducible uncertainty, because you can't reduce it to probabilities. That's real, that's what every single person in this room and out in the outside world deals with every single day. It's crucial, so we ought to be getting it into the economics somewhere. Last point here. Many orthodox economists do talk about uncertainty when they're explaining what's going on in the real world. They have to because they can't explain it using optimizing agents who don't make mistakes. Something went wrong, so, the theory didn't work, so we shift to a different discourse. That is a very common sense way of approaching it, but it is in conflict with the core theory. Core theory doesn't have this. Keynes got onto this in the 1930s. If no one else got onto it before him, he said there was a clash between their common sense and their theory. But they never reconciled that. They just lived with that contradiction, and that's still going on. Okay, so just let me finish this, a little bit of history economic thought now. Paul Samuelson, a very famous economist, now dead, who was responsible for what was called the neoclassical synthesis, which was a marriage of neoclassical theory with what was then thought to be Keynesian theory. It wasn't really Keynesian theory, it was this a very poor caricature of Keynesian theory. He married the two together and formed American Keynesianism, and then that's sort of morphed into new Keynesianism today. His view of economics is very interesting and very relevant. This is what he said. Back in 1968, the proper place of economics is in the realm of science. Whoopee, yes, we all agree with that. Not in the realm of genuine history where things only happen once. Ooh, wrong. How could you say such a stupid thing? Economies move through time and history. They only pass this way once. So one bit's terrific, the other bit is hopeless. Why is the hopeless bit there? Because he's a mathematician, he wants to mathematize economics, and you have to assume timeless, spaceless, genderless, everything less economic theory to mathematize it. So everything goes into equations. So, and he says very explicitly In the old days, people were much more explicit about assumptions. He said, I'm assuming agents live forever. They're all exactly the same. And they all have perfect knowledge, or they have probabilities. It was clear back then in the 1960s. It's all become blurred and camouflaged these days. And Robert Barrow, in more recent times, he's still alive, neoclassical, rational expectations person. He takes exactly the same line. Radical uncertainty has no place in economics. It's barred. Just push it away. So, that's the major limitation or a big problem with orthodox economics. Are there alternatives? Yes, of course there are. But here you have to turn to pluralist economics and look at other schools of thought which approach radical uncertainty seriously, not just as a difficult problem that you push to one side and pretend you're dealing with. So at least 5 schools. The post-Keynesian school following Keynes, of course they're going to be big on this. Austrian economics have always been big on uncertainty, although they're quite conservative and many of their conclusions are very market-friendly, like the Orthodox school. They have their strong points of departure from the neoclassical school, and one of them was that they took uncertainty seriously. Institutionalist economics also takes an uncertainty because they recognise we all live in a world of uncertainty, and so we need institutions that help us deal with that uncertainty. Ecological economics also deals with it, especially in the precautionary principle. If you've got 2 projects before you and one's going to produce huge benefits, but it's very risky in terms of its environmental consequences, then the precautionary, and then there's another safer, smaller one, not so many benefits but less damage to the environment. You adopt the precautionary principle and go with the one with the least risk. So, you're being risk averse or uncertainty averse in going for the smaller, possibly less environmentally damaging consequence. And then behavioural economics also deals with uncertainty, but in a very careful way, because depending on the kind of behavioural economist you are, you can be a radical or a conservative here. If you're a conservative, you want to keep in close contact with the mainstream. You don't want to offend them too much. So you're just filling in the gaps, solving the anomalies that they can't solve. You're helping them. And of course you will refer to uncertainty and so forth. But if you're a radical behavioural economist, you say, our stuff undermines the perfectly informed optimising agent. Human beings aren't like that at all. And they go off in a different direction. They're more likely to take uncertainty seriously than the other kind of behavioural economics. So the first 2 are the best known, and I'm going to focus on Keynes because he is the main area of my research. But if you want to be an Austrian, fine. There's lots of stuff in the Austrian literature about uncertainty. So let's talk a little bit about Keynes. He was a philosopher before he was an economist. And what did he do in philosophy? Effectively, his PhD was a philosophical study of probability, not a mathematical one, but a philosophical one. And so it was all about uncertainty. His claim was every single argument that humans make, whether it's in science, everyday life, religion, wherever, they're all uncertain unless they are deductive. The only certain form of argument is a deductive one. And that depends whether the conclusion is going to be true or not, depends on the truth of the premises. But nearly all the other arguments we have in our daily lives and in science, and the climate science is a perfect example, you can only reach probabilistic conclusions. The evidence you have does not prove deductively anything. It just produces a very high probability that the conclusion is right. So if I can just do a little number now on the climate science debate. This is a digression. Climate scientists in favour of climate change, or saying it's real and exists and so forth, I'm on their side, but I don't like the way they've cast their argument. They've miscast it in the sense of they're saying climate change or human-induced climate change is a certainty. It's not, in my book. It's an event with extremely high probability. That's all. As soon as you say it's a certainty, other people will jump up, the skeptics will jump up and say, no, it's not a certainty, you can't prove that, you're wrong. And so the whole debate gets miscast between the people who are saying it's certain and the other people who are saying, no, you can't prove it. And the skeptics who have a point. But as soon as you recast it in terms of probabilities, human-induced climate change has got a very, very, very high probability, and your story's got a very, very low probability. Everyone can relax, give them the ground, but give them a little bit of ground, but no influence on the world, and the majority scientific consensus can go forward. That's the sort of thing that Keynes was looking at in this philosophical work. And the important thing was, for our discussion, is that he distinguished between probabilistic uncertainty, where you had probabilities, and non-probabilistic uncertainty, where you didn't have probabilities. You just didn't have enough information to figure out what the probabilities would be. If you're writing a book about probabilities, you tend to focus on the probabilistic kind of uncertainty. There's not much to say in a book about probabilities, about uncertainty where there are no probabilities. That's a different kind of discussion, which then crops up in his economics. And it's not just related to investment, where it's the commonest example is given. It's consumption, it's saving, it's financial asset, speculation, policy making, a whole range of things. So just quickly dealing with investment. This is Keynes' story, not the neoclassical story. Investment is based on long-term expectations, because investment projects are carried out for 5, 10, 20 years. And they're based on the expected returns of the project over that time frame. So you need to have some idea or some guess about what prices and costs are going to be over that time frame. Yes, we have current information, but we don't know what prices are going to be or costs are going to be, what wages will be, etc., raw materials prices, etc., etc. 5 years, 10 years, 20 years into the future. You just have to guess them. We don't even know what they will probably be. No mining company can forecast, say that the price of iron ore is likely to be between $10 and $20, probability 75% in 10 years' time. They're not silly enough to say that, because they know that it could easily be falsified. So they make guesses. So without all this knowledge, the investment decision is based on other factors, many of them psychological. It's got flimsy foundations based on an urge to act rather than not act. That's what Keynes called animal spirits. It's going to be strongly influenced by psychology, levels of confidence. If the general level of confidence in the economy is low, then there's not going to be much investment. If it's high, yes, let's go for it. You have to be a contrarian to go against the current, and there might be some of those who say, I always go against the current, so if everyone else is pessimistic, I'll be optimistic. But there'll be some psychological basis behind their action. So investment can stay depressed for long periods, and with it GDP and the economy, or it can go through volatile swings over time. The key thing about Keynes' theory, it was a general theory because it encompassed many, many different outcomes, not just a unique full employment outcome in the long run. You had multiple equilibria, and nearly all of them were suboptimal in the long run, not just the short run, but in the long run. And it's no surprise that if you introduce uncertainty as one of your initial assumptions, it's there at the beginning, you're not going to reach the nice, market-friendly, markets are wonderful kinds of conclusions you get in neoclassical economics, where every agent is optimizing correctly and being totally rational, etc., because they've got all the wherewithal to do that. The outcomes of your theorizing are going to be quite different. So, for a laissez-faire economy, that's to say no government, no central bank, just private sector only, you get three main types of equilibria. You probably know this. Unemployment equilibria, economies in recession or depression. That's the commonest case. Second most common, but not that common, is inflationary equilibria, where you've got full employment and a high inflation rate. And then lastly, full employment, non-inflationary equilibria. That's the golden state, the nirvana, that neoclassical economics reaches with its long-run theorizing. That is a complete fluke in the Keynesian story. It's possible, but almost, the probability of reaching that is so low, of the market system by itself attaining that is so low that it's close to zero, but we won't say it is zero. So if you want an economy to function well, to perform optimally, macro level, you need to have the state in there with fiscal policy and a central bank in there with monetary policy to help manage the level of demand so that it guides the private sector, assists and guides and encourages the private sector to achieve that full employment, low inflation equilibrium. Nowadays we've got low inflation maintained because that's part of monetary policy, but the fiscal policy side is missing in action. With Keynes, you have a different kind of modelling. The neoclassical style of modelling is to stick everything into a set of equations. Equations can be infinitely varied, so there's an infinite number of possible ways of doing things in neoclassical economics, or if you go down the mathematical road. Keynes, on the other hand, is a mixture of, yes, we'll use maths when it's useful, but most of the stuff that's important is qualitative, not quantitative. So long-term expectations, animal spirits, confidence psychology, they're the things, these are the qualitative or non-quantitative things that you can't stick into equations, or not very successfully, that are really driving the economy. So instead of mucking around with mathematical models all the time, we find sometimes that we don't want to get rid of them, but we ought to allow space for non-mathematical or more qualitative, or some mixture of the two to be operating. In terms of long-term expectations, if you want to understand the forces that are determining them, you have to go outside economics, to history. You can look at past crises or past depressions and see what was going on. And then that can be information that you might say is applicable to the current recession. You can't say for sure, but it's a guide. It's information which might lead you to form probabilities about what's likely to happen in this recession. These things are outside economics, but really ought to be brought inside, but aren't in the neoclassical school. You've got to turn to other schools. The point is, you can't stick them into deterministic equations and solve your model and get the answer. Okay, this is what's going to happen. Now, in the context of uncertainty, you might have heard of the name of Frank Knight, an American economist who also emphasized uncertainty in economics. And often Knight is credited with what's called the risk-uncertainty distinction. However, Keynes and Knight formulated their ideas around about the same time. In fact, I think Keynes preceded Knight by about 7 or 8 years, but that's not important now. So they're both pushing this idea that uncertainty is important. However, there are differences between their treatments, and they had different purposes for emphasizing uncertainty. So Knight was an orthodox economist who focused on only one problem, and that's why he introduced uncertainty into economics. And that problem was, how do we explain the existence of abnormal profits? And for him, the risk-bearing theory of profit was wrong, because if you've got a risk situation, which is where there are probabilities, then there will be an insurance company who will have those probabilities, and they will offer you insurance against your enterprise failing. Because they'll know the risks, the probabilities, they can make a business, and you can insure yourself. So the costs of insuring yourself just go into the ordinary costs and profit's going to be revenue minus costs, and the risk-bearing side of it goes into the costs. So it can't explain the difference between the costs and the revenue, profit that you want to explain. So Knight said, okay, there's something else going on that explains this, and that is uncertainty when you don't have the probabilities. So he brought it in, used it to explain one problem, and one problem only, and then left it. Because to him, that was the job of uncertainty, to explain the existence of abnormal profits. After that, orthodox economics was fine. The rest of the core stayed the same. Along came Keynes, emphasising uncertainty, but Knight is very hostile to the general theory because it's mucking up the core. Even though Keynes is emphasising uncertainty, which Knight thinks is important, Knight has corralled it into just dealing with one problem. He gets very angry with Keynes for wanting to say everything, all decision making is uncertain, etc., and the core theory doesn't hold anymore. But Keynes's aim was always to have realistic assumptions that reflected as far as possible the way people actually behave. And you build your theory up on those foundations, not imaginary foundations of how an ideally rational agent might maximise. An agent of a particular kind might maximise. What do you have to give them to get that result? Well, you give them that, and off you go and develop a theory. No, Keynes said that's all nonsense. It leads to silly answers and wrong answers. Start with real people, make your assumptions that reflect their behaviour, and see where you go. What comes out of that sort of reasoning, and bingo, it's suboptimal equilibrium, not the perfect ideal situation. Now, all this leads into another area of economics, which sadly has been cut out of most economics curricula and degrees these days, and that's the methodology of economics or the philosophy of economics. I want to talk a little bit about that because this is important too, as well as the other things. Assumptions are very, very important in any theory, in any discipline, because they define the conditions of applicability of that theory. No physicist is going to try and apply a theory where the assumptions in the theory contradict the assumptions of the situation with which they're trying to deal. They will just say, this is inappropriate, wrong theory. Give me a theory where the assumptions match the situation. Not in economics. What's happened to assumptions these days in most of the textbooks is they've been turned into something else. You'll still find them mentioned, but the textbooks will begin with, taking Gregory Mankiw as an example, 10 lessons in economics or 10 principles of economics. When you look at those principles, half of them are assumptions. They've just changed the terminology, and as if these are lessons or truths that you either know now at the beginning of the book or you know at the end of the book, but I'm telling you now just in case you miss the point by reading the book. You walk away with your 10 truths of economics. And half of them are just assumptions, turned into truths. That's, obfuscation. Turning things into something that they're not, just to cover up some weaknesses. Any good, critical, intelligent person will look at if the assumptions are written down in a list, and they went through them carefully, how many of these do you believe? There'd be very few that an intelligent person would tick as being correct. So good economists know their assumptions and then can judge the applicability of the theories and their strengths and their limitations. If you hide the assumptions, you are hiding the limitations. And that's, I think, a lot of why the story, the textbooks don't talk so much about assumptions, they use different words. Thank you. And pre-GFC thinking, what did we have? The great moderation, the consensus, the state of macroeconomics is good, everything's fine in economics, and then boom, the world blows up. Financial crisis spreading over into an economic crisis. The important question is, what is the purpose of the assumptions? When you choose assumptions, what's your purpose? Is it to reflect reality? to assist the understanding of the real economy and develop policies that will really help us go forward? Or is it to ensure that mathematical tractability applies? You can get a set of equations and solve them and come up with an answer. That's not going to help. If those equations don't include the main important driving forces, they're not going to help in understanding the world or fixing its problems. All right. I've been rattling on a bit about mathematics, so let's just polish that off a bit. Is it the royal road to economic science, or is it something else? It certainly is in physics, and a lot of economics is copying physics, as if it were a natural science, which it's not. It's about people. So, trying to pretend it's a natural science and following the methodology of a natural science is only going to be detrimental to a social science. So, the question is, will maths be the servant or the master? If it's the master, then the assumptions are always massaged so that they can be stuck into equations. But if it's the servant, you can always use it when it's appropriate and useful. You start with assumptions that are realistic, and you bring the maths in when you can. It's a powerful, useful tool. But if it's given the role of being the dominant determinant of how you theorise, it can be disastrous for economics. We need theories focused on this world of people who live in societies, not a toy world where agents are simply robots. They do the same thing over and over again, no matter what the circumstances. You maximise, maximise, maximise. No matter what the context, the time, the place, whatever, they're just little robots. People are different. Their behaviour can change over time and as a consequence of circumstances. They learn stuff, etc., etc. All right, so just further consequences of this perfect knowledge assumption. Of course, it eliminates uncertainty, real uncertainty. It eliminates time and history. If you know everything from now until the future, or you've got a way of calculating everything from now until the future, time and history are unimportant. You don't have to wait for anything to happen to find out, wait for time to pass to find out what's going to happen. You already know. So, ahistorical timeless analysis is not helping. You rule out money in any meaningful sense. In a general equilibrium theory, you don't need money at all. You just pick one of the goods as your numeraire and express all the prices in terms of carrots and do your calculations. It's just a unit of account. That's all you need, and that's not real money. So you don't need money, but money is crucially important in the real world because that's what people are chasing. They want more money, they're going to make money. And all the variables they toss around and so forth in their heads when they do investment and all that, they're all nominal, not real. And if you've left out money, then you don't need a central bank, and monetary policy. The government's not theirs because it's all just a big private sector. But all of these are essential in the real world. So if you assume perfect knowledge, you're implicitly assuming these things don't matter. Okay, I want to finish up by giving you some questions that you should ask in your reading, and even, if you dare, do it politely, in lectures. What are the main assumptions of the theory that we are now dealing with? Both the explicit ones, and look for hidden ones. There often are nowadays, the way textbooks are written, hidden assumptions lurking under there, which are either unstated or camouflaged. Once you've isolated them, are they realistic or not? Could they possibly exist in this world? If they couldn't possibly exist or they're not realistic, why have they been chosen? What's the point of choosing those kinds of assumptions? Is it for mathematical tractability? Is it for generating conclusions that are going to support markets? Which is veering off in the direction of ideology. Markets are always good, governments are always bad, etc., etc. Next question is, you've got to ask, what are the adjustment mechanism. What's the story behind the adjustment mechanisms that lead you from disequilibrium to equilibrium, or from one equilibrium to another after an exogenous shock? Same thing. Sometimes a wave of the hand, we move from this equilibrium to the other. Competition makes it happen. Boom, boom, we're there. But when you ask and think about, well, how do they move? You find often the story is either weak, pathetic, or impossible. Very often you will find that you cannot find a good, rational, intelligent narrative that will lead you from this equilibrium, from E1 to E2. Not always. Sometimes there are stories and they fit in with the theory and it's okay. You may not believe the theory, but there is a narrative that you can follow that fits in with the theory. But other times there is no narrative that fits in with the theory. It's just a wave of the hand. And that's not good enough. And why are we always assuming perfect competition in our models? Nearly always, just about all of them. Perfect competition does not exist. Forget the textbooks and their little examples of perfect competition. It does not exist. It cannot possibly exist. If you think about it rigorously, it's impossible for it to exist. So why are we always assuming? Because it's an ideal world. Because you get a supply curve. Because you can do all these fabulous things with it and derive mathematical models. Okay, let me finish. So look, my main message is if we want to get better economists, by that I mean more knowledgeable, more reflective economists, we've got to change the curriculum. The current strategy has been, across the world, with a few minor exceptions, eliminate a whole series of subjects that lead to alternatives or to reflection or thought about economics. They're just useless, and replace them with more mathematics and more econometrics. That is destroying economics. For two reasons: it's pedagogically failing to produce better economists, and because enrolments the world over are falling. Again, there are a few exceptions where enrolments might be growing, but economics is losing the battle in business faculties. Accounting, management, marketing, sport and leisure, whatever, are all far more attractive options for someone coming into a business school. That's how the high school students see it. Better careers, easier subject, more interesting material. I'm going to enjoy this. Economics has got a reputation of being hard, tough, mathematical and dry and abstract and bleh. So your average student is going to get off in that direction, up, down, out. And departments, staff numbers are shrinking and departments are also shrinking. Across the world, economics departments are being eliminated. Economics is still taught, but it's just as a service subject, but degrees, economic degrees are disappearing. So we need to change the curriculum, and we just need to go back to a revitalised version of what existed 30 or 40 years ago, when you had history of economic thought in the curriculum, you had methodology of economics, you studied alternative schools of thought, and there's one other missing.
Economic history.
Economic history, yes. All those things were standard parts of the curriculum. You could even do your PhD in one of those areas. Now you'd be crazy if you wanted to do a PhD and proposed a topic in the history of economic thought. Even if it was possible, you'd be crazy. You won't have a career.